Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com. General Patton said, "If everybody is thinking the same, then somebody isn't thinking." And Albert Einstein said, "No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong." Climate alarmism can't exist without graphs like this one from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The graph makes it look like the world is heating up out of control. In this video, I'm going to examine whether or not this graph is credible, particularly focusing on the year 1921. But before I get into that, I'm going to engage in a short discussion of methodology. I've spent the last few decades doing mission-critical engineering projects. Right now, I'm developing navigation systems for military aircraft. But 30 years ago, I was designing microprocessors for IBM, Apple, and Motorola. My job was to flesh out errors in the design. This was known as verification. I was given this plaque by the design team, the PowerPC 604 RISC microprocessor made functional by Tony Debug God Hiller. Over the course of a year, I found about 600 defects in the design, or about 3 for every working day of the year. And I used a somewhat unconventional approach to find the defects. Rather than trying to understand the thinking which the designer was using and seeing if it was correct, I did something completely different. I wrote a high-level model of the correct functionality of the microprocessor. If a portion of the design didn't match the higher-level model, I suspected that there was something wrong with the design. And only then would I go in and look at their design to see what they were doing wrong. The problem with trying to reproduce their thinking is exactly what General Patton said. If everybody's thinking the same, then somebody isn't thinking. The way I verified the design was by thinking differently. And that's how I'm going to analyze this temperature graph. I'm not going to try to reproduce how they made the graph, but rather I'm going to look at whether or not the graph makes sense. The first thing I'm going to do is compare what NOAA is saying now with what they were saying 30 years ago. This is what they were saying in 1989. Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Tom Carl of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Climatic Data Center. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Carl said. It strikes me immediately that what NOAA was saying in 1989 bears no resemblance to their current graph. In 1989, they said that most of the increase in global temperature since 1881 happened before 1919. But now their graph shows a lot of cooling from 1881 to 1919. This is the exact opposite of what they were saying in 1989. In 1989, they said that Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979. But now NOAA shows a lot of warming from 1921 to 1979. It is abundantly clear that they have massively altered their data, which makes this graph extremely suspect. And the fact that they said Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979 gives us a pretty strong hint that 1921 must have been a warm year. But now they show 1921 as being one of the coldest years on record. We are already seeing lots of red flags that this graph is fraudulent. Now let's take a closer look at what was going on in 1921. This graph of Northern Hemisphere temperatures from the National Academy of Sciences was published in the early 1970s. It showed that 1921 was one of the warmest years on record and that temperatures cooled after that into the 1970s. This graph is the temperature reconstruction of Briff and Jones, which should have been used in the 2001 IPCC report instead of Michael Mann's fraudulent hockey stick. It showed that temperatures around 1921 were very warm, and then temperatures cooled dramatically into the 1970s. This is the U.S. temperature graph which NASA published in 1999. It showed 1921 as being the second warmest year in the United States after 1934. U.S. temperature data is extremely important. This map from NOAA shows where they have daily temperature data from 1891 to 1920. The vast majority of their high-quality temperature data is from the United States. They also have some from Western Europe, a little bit from Asia, and parts of Australia. But most of the world has little or no coverage. This makes the U.S. temperature data extremely important. And NASA showed 1921 as being the second warmest year in the United States. This graph shows the percent of days above 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the United States going back to 1895. 1921 was a very warm year. More than 2/3 of the days were over 60 degrees Fahrenheit. 1921 was the hottest year in Texas. 1921 was the hottest year in West Virginia. 1921 was the hottest year in Tennessee. 1921 was the hottest year in Pennsylvania. 1921 was the hottest year in Ohio. 1921 was the hottest year in Mississippi. 1921 was the hottest year in Michigan. 1921 was the hottest year in Maryland. 1921 was the hottest year in Louisiana. 1921 was the hottest year in Kentucky. 1921 was the hottest year in Indiana. 1921 was the hottest year in Illinois. And 1921 was the hottest year in Delaware. The warmest February temperature ever recorded in Los Angeles was 92 degrees on February 25, 1921. What was really remarkable about the heat wave of 1921 is that the warm temperatures lasted almost the entire year. The New York Herald reported death for millions in 1921's record heat wave. The Great Heat Wave, which has spread over the world during the present summer, has no parallel in history. Abnormally high temperatures have prevailed in almost all parts of the Northern Hemisphere and have continued for an unprecedented length of time. Lake Morad in Switzerland dried up due to the heat wave and drought. This is what that same lake looks like now. The New York Times reported on October 3, 1921, a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. 2 million Koreans starving in Manchuria owing to drought-ruined crops. Drought kills fish in River Seine, and France suffers most severe drought in 47 years. Save the Children took out this ad in the Daily Telegraph on August 4, 1921. The worst disaster in history. This is a pretty impressive claim considering it came right after 50 million dead from the Spanish flu, which came after 20 million dead in World War I. The San Francisco Examiner wrote this article, Science and Our Worldwide Upset Weather. The astonishing theory that the disastrous heat and drought of the summer were due to our solar system passing through a vast, unseen cosmic cloud at a time when sunspots were hottest. They talked about a worldwide heat wave and drought, destruction of crops, giant forest fires in Canada. In England and France, there was practically no rainfall from January through August. In Switzerland, melting glaciers and snow caused floods and avalanches. Persistent higher temperatures began in August 1920, and for the succeeding 12 months, there was an average monthly excess above normal of 3.4 degrees. The graphic newspaper in London described it as a sizzling October. They had an unprecedented heat wave, which included 4 days over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Besides the extreme heat, there was also terrible flooding in the United States. During early June 1921, Pueblo, Colorado experienced one of the deadliest floods in U.S. history. This came a couple of weeks after one of the largest solar storms ever recorded. The northern lights were plainly visible in Austin, Texas on May 15, 1921. The monthly weather review in November 1922 reported tremendous heating in the Arctic. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard-of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. Strange things happening in the frozen Arctic, and you can see the lack of sea ice around Spitsbergen during the winter of 1921-1922. In January 1922, explorer Stephenson said that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was young, thin, rotten, moving ice. This is very different from the propaganda which we're constantly exposed to, saying that 100 years ago Arctic sea ice was very thick. Apparently, that's simply not true. In 1923, Glacier National Park was melting so quickly that experts predicted the ice would be gone by the year 1950. The glaciers in Glacier National Park retreated very rapidly from 1850 to 1950, and then the recession slowed down considerably into the 1990s. And over the last 30 years, the glaciers in Glacier National Park have actually expanded. This is what the Swift Current Glacier looked like in 1991, and this is what it looked like 30 years later. This bare rock has disappeared, as have these crevasses over near the edge. This is what it looks like now. These glaciers were retreating very rapidly around 1920, but now the same glaciers are growing. The same thing was going on in Norway. Glaciers retreated very rapidly between 1869, 1933, and 1946. This takes me back to the graph which we're trying to verify. If this graph were correct, that would mean that glaciers melt very rapidly when it's cold, and glaciers advance when temperatures are much warmer. In other words, this graph is not in the least bit credible. It's propaganda, not science. The 1989 version of National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration temperatures was credible, but the current version, which they've altered, is not legitimate. The data in this graph has been altered and it does not match the historical record. The graph shows 1921 as being a very cold year, when in fact it was a very warm year. But if people saw a legitimate graph of global temperatures, nobody would be concerned about global warming and their funding would dry up. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this spectacular scam for the past 15 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki Upala, and the 4 new puppies on the web at realclimatescience.com.